Well, today we have another Californian on the line, or at least for now he's a Californian. Arzan Tarapur has been resident of a couple of different countries. I first met him in Australia, I believe on a visit. He is now a research scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford, which of course is where I do a lot of my work. And his research focuses on India and Indian regional security issues. He previously worked, so, sort of telegraphing our disdain for academia. We're letting him on because he previously worked as a practitioner for 13 years in the Australian Defense Department. And Arzan, just so you know, our disdain is only because we don't have any of those degrees ourselves.
Well, thanks, Ray. I have a fair degree of self-loathing myself, so we're all in good company.
Well, then you're part of the club. That's good.
Well, we're happy to be able to do another India episode. Our previous India episode has got something like 30,000 views on YouTube. So it's India is a great place to spread the word about our podcast and our work. And so and it's a great place for us to sort of expand our horizons, because neither of us were really India hands at all during our time in service. But you have recently been doing some work specifically on the question of India's Navy. And so we're going to ask you our usual question, which is the why should we care question. Why should we care if India seems to be deprioritizing investments in its Navy?
Yeah, big question, Ray. Thanks first of all for having me on. I really like the title of your podcast and therefore the mission of your podcast. So I'm a big believer in what you're doing. So thanks for having me on, and thanks for making sure that India is part of the Indo-Pacific. So first of all, kudos. And secondly, to answer that question, it part of the answer to that is because we are talking about the Indo-Pacific, and India, as successive US administrations have said, is an anchor of US policy in the region. It is, in fact, an anchor of the Indo-Pacific, right? When we think about the Indo-Pacific, I think of that, and I know different people have different views, I think of it as two big oceans and their littorals. And so if you are concerned about the Indo-Pacific, then you have to be concerned about India and its role in the Indian Ocean region, and therefore its role as one of the key players in the whole larger region of the Indo-Pacific. Now, we can get into the Navy issue, but essentially India acts in the region across the Indian Ocean region primarily through its ability, in military terms, to project force across the water. And so therefore, whatever happens to the Indian Navy happens to the Indian Ocean, and whatever happens to the Indian Ocean happens to the Indo-Pacific.
I guess the question for us is, we've been trying as Americans and Australians to bring India closer into our grouping for security purposes. And while the Quad is not a security entity, whatever it is a means to try and bring them closer to us. How does this comport with India's self-image as still a leader of non-aligned movement?
So I think, first of all, non-aligned has been sort of overtaken by a gentler version of a similar idea, which is essentially strategic autonomy, right? And I think in today's India, the way that idea is most often or most compellingly expressed is India as being one of the poles of a multipolar world. I think that is the way that the current government of India sees its role in the world, as one of the poles in a multipolar system. And so they would probably take exception to the idea that the US and Australia are the point to which India is being drawn, right? Because from their point of view, they are an independent and powerful actor in the world, as is the United States. And the two countries, the US and India, have a certain degree of overlapping interests, but also a certain degree of policy divergences, like any two countries would. And so while the US and Australia are treaty allies and have been historically very close, very deep and broad relationship, the relationship with India is newer, less deep, less broad, but very important because it is a very big and powerful country. And so the issue is not about bringing India in, right? Because that's the sort of mentality of the US leading a bloc. That's not the correct framing here. The correct framing is there are several countries that matter, that shape the Indo-Pacific. And the United States and India are two of the most important countries in the region. And to the extent that they have overlapping national security interests, it behooves them, as well as other middle powers like Australia, to work more closely together. And so that's where a lot of my research lies, in trying to understand what are India's interests, what are those overlaps, what are those divergences, and how can we all work as best as we can together to maintain, as the governments would call it, a free and open Indo-Pacific.